let's jump into another deep dive. This time we're tackling a book that, well, it kind of flips the script on how we usually think about Germany's role in the world wars. The book is called The Myth of German Villainy by Benton L. Bradbury. And, well, it pretty much argues that this whole idea of Germans being inherently evil is a myth.
It definitely challenges some commonly held beliefs.
So we're going to go on a bit of a historical journey here, starting with the events leading up to World War I and going all the way through World War II. We'll be looking at things like the impact of propaganda and, just the sheer devastation of these global conflicts. This book doesn't shy away from controversy, that's for sure.
Right off the bat, it throws us a curveball, you know? It talks about the immense suffering Germany went through during World War II. I mean, the casualties, the destruction, it was massive. But then it asks this really thought-provoking question. Did they deserve it?
It's like that saying, history is written by the victors.
Exactly. The book really emphasizes that point. Germany lost both world wars, so their perspective, their story, it hasn't always been given the same weight. Take the Nuremberg trials, for example. The book portrays those trials as being more about solidifying a predetermined narrative rather than, delivering true justice.
And speaking of the Nuremberg trials, there's this detail the book brings up. I got to admit, I'd never heard this before. It mentions that a lot of the people involved in the trials, like the prosecutors and judges, they were Jewish. And then it points out that the hangings of the Nazi leaders happened on Purim.
Yeah.
Which is a Jewish holiday.
A holiday that commemorates the execution of enemies of the Jews.
It's pretty, it's a pretty striking detail.
It is. And the book uses that detail to suggest that maybe there wasn't as much impartiality in those trials as we'd like to think.
Right.
It raises questions about whether it was truly about justice or more about
contribution.
It's a controversial viewpoint for sure. But it makes you step back and think critically about how history is presented.
Yeah. And who's benefiting from certain narratives, for sure. Now, let's shift gears a bit and talk about propaganda, especially during World War I. Bradbury makes this really interesting argument. He says that one of the biggest atrocities of that war wasn't actually a physical act of violence, but the British propaganda machine.
Yeah, he goes deep on that, especially focusing on something called the Bryce Report.
Oh, I've heard of it.
This was a British document. It was widely circulated, and it claimed that German soldiers were committing all these horrific atrocities in Belgium.
Oh, like what kind of atrocities?
Well, for example, the report claimed that German soldiers were bayoneting babies. Just awful stuff.
Oh, wow.
But the book really picks apart this report, It challenges its claims. It points out that there's no real evidence to back up these stories.
No physical evidence.
Right. No credible eyewitness accounts. Nothing.
It's amazing how much power a single report can have.
It is.
Especially in a time of war.
Yeah.
People are already scared and anxious.
Absolutely. And then you have this report filled with these horrifying stories. It's bound to have an impact.
Didn't some American lawyer offer a reward for proof of those atrocities?
Yes. Clarence Darrow. He put up a significant amount of money for anyone who could provide evidence to support the Bryce Report, but no one ever came forward. So it really makes you wonder about the truth of those allegations.
Yeah, for sure. So it sounds like this propaganda really had a lasting effect.
Oh, absolutely.
Probably poisoned public opinion towards Germany.
Yeah.
And likely contributed to the harsh terms of the Versailles Treaty.
The book argues that the Versailles Treaty was a major factor in setting the stage for World War II.
Right, because it created so much resentment and instability.
Exactly.
Okay, so before we get into the events leading up to World War II, let's rewind a bit. Go back to the late 19th century. This is a time when Germany was rapidly becoming an industrial powerhouse.
A real force to be reckoned with.
I imagine that must have made the other European powers pretty nervous.
Oh, absolutely. You have this new player on the scene, growing in strength. It's bound to create some anxiety.
Especially for countries like Britain, France, and Russia.
Right. They were the established powers. And they saw Germany's ambition as a threat to the balance of power in Europe.
So to try and contain Germany,
yeah,
these three countries formed the Triple Entente.
Essentially a defensive alliance aimed at keeping Germany's ambitions in check.
It seems like that put Germany in a pretty tough spot.
It did. The book argues that this encirclement, combined with economic rivalries and all these nationalist sentiments that were brewing, it created a really volatile situation, a situation that made war almost inevitable.
And this is where the book gets really controversial. It brings up what it calls the Jewish factor in the lead up to both world wars.
It's a complex and sensitive topic.
It is. But the book argues that Jewish financial and political influence, which was often opposed to German interests, played a significant role in shaping how things played out.
It's a perspective that's definitely open to debate. But the book presents a lot of evidence to support its claims.
One of the key historical events the book examines through this lens is the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia.
Yeah, that's a crucial point.
I remember learning about the Bolsheviks in school, but I never really understood the whole story.
Well, it's a complicated story, but essentially, the Bolshevik Revolution led to the overthrow of the Tsar and the establishment of the Soviet Union.
Okay.
The book highlights how the German government actually played a role in this revolution. They funded Lenin and the Bolsheviks, hoping that it would weaken Russia and force them out of World War I.
So the Germans were kind of playing a dangerous game there.
They were trying to manipulate events to their advantage.
And how does this Jewish factor tie into the Bolshevik Revolution?
The book points out that there were a lot of Jewish individuals in the Bolshevik leadership, and it argues that their ideological and political influence was a key factor in how the revolution unfolded.
So it's suggesting that their involvement
Was significant.
in shaping the course of events.
And ultimately, the rise of the Soviet Union.
It definitely seems like we're just scratching the surface here. But let's bring it back to Germany for a moment. What happened after World War I? How did the country recover from such a devastating defeat?
Well, it wasn't an easy recovery. Germany went through a period of intense political instability and economic hardship. This period is known as the Weimar Republic.
Okay.
And during this time, a lot of extremist ideologies started to gain traction,
Including National Socialism.
which, of course, would eventually lead to World War II.
Okay, so it sounds like we're about to get into some even more controversial territory here. But I think we need to take a break. We'll pick up this story in the next part of our deep dive and explore how Germany went from the ashes of World War I to the brink of another global conflict.
It's a fascinating and complex story.
It is, and one that challenges a lot of our assumptions about history. We'll see you back here soon to delve deeper into the myth of German villainy. So we left off talking about the Weimar Republic, that period of intense upheaval in Germany after World War I.
Yeah, a nation trying to pick up the pieces after a crushing defeat. Dealing with economic collapse and just this feeling of humiliation after the Versailles Treaty. It's a recipe for unrest, really.
Absolutely, and it's during this time that National Socialism, the Nazi Party,
Yep.
it really starts to gain momentum. So how does the book explain the appeal of National Socialism in this context?
Well, the book suggests that it was seen as a response to a couple of major threats. One was the perceived threat of communism, which was gaining ground in Europe at the time, and the other was the perceived decadence and instability of the Weimar Republic itself.
I see, so it wasn't just about blaming others or hatred.
No. The book argues that many Germans, they were drawn to the Nazi Party's promises of economic recovery, social welfare programs, and, this idea of a strong, unified Germany.
Its idea of restoring national pride.
Exactly.
The book also talks about the role of Jewish influence during this period,
Yeah.
which is always a sensitive topic.
It is. But the book highlights how Jewish individuals, they held prominent positions in various aspects of German society, particularly in finance, media, and the arts. And it argues that this visibility, combined with the economic struggles of the time, it contributed to growing anti-Semitic sentiment.
So it wasn't just individual prejudice.
Yeah.
There was this broader societal context that allowed these sentiments to take root.
Absolutely. The book really digs into how the political and economic climate of the Weimar Republic created this breeding ground for tension and prejudice.
Right. And the Nazi Party was able to exploit that.
Very effectively. They were masters of propaganda,
Yeah.
and they knew how to tap into people's fears and anxieties.
Okay, so let's talk about Hitler himself, because the book actually tries to present a more, I guess you could say, nuanced view of him.
It does.
It argues that he was a complex figure, driven by this desire to make Germany strong again.
To restore its greatness.
Exactly,
Mhm.
and to protect it from these perceived threats,
Sure.
including communism and,
Right.
as the book suggests,
Mhm.
Jewish influence.
It challenges the traditional view of Hitler as this purely evil, irrational dictator. And instead, it tries to understand his motivations within the historical context of his time.
So it's asking us to look beyond the simple good versus evil narrative,
Exactly. To recognize that history is rarely that simple.
even when we're talking about someone like Hitler.
Even then, the book doesn't deny the atrocities of the Nazi regime, but it encourages us to try to understand how such horrors could happen.
To understand the historical context.
Right.
Okay, so we have Germany struggling to recover from defeat. We have this charismatic leader promising national revival. And a society grappling with all these economic and social anxieties.
It's a volatile mix.
It is. So how does the book explain the lead up to World War II?
It argues that Hitler's foreign policy was primarily driven by a desire to regain lost territories.
From World War I.
Yes, and also to unite ethnic Germans under one nation, and to establish Germany as the dominant power in Europe,
So his actions
which were undoubtedly aggressive,
were seen by many Germans as necessary.
to restore the nation's greatness and protect it from these perceived threats.
But weren't there opportunities to prevent another war? Like, what about appeasement?
The book does address appeasement, those policies adopted by Britain and France in the years leading up to the war.
Right.
It argues that while those policies were intended to avoid conflict, they actually ended up emboldening Hitler because he was able to expand his territorial ambitions without facing any serious consequences.
And then there was the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, that non-aggression pact between Germany and the Soviet Union.
Right, that was a huge turning point. It shocked the world.
It did. What does the book say about that?
It digs into the secret provisions of that pact, which basically divided Eastern Europe into spheres of influence for Germany and the Soviet Union.
So it was all about.
Realpolitik, each side looking out for its own interests.
It's amazing how the book connects all these events.
It really weaves together this complex tapestry of history.
Okay, now I want to talk about Winston Churchill, because he's often portrayed as this heroic figure, the man who stood up to Hitler.
Yeah, the iconic wartime leader.
But how does the book portray his role in the events leading up to the war?
It's an interesting take. It presents Churchill as a staunch anti-communist, someone who saw Germany as a potential ally in the fight against Bolshevism.
So he wasn't just this unwavering opponent of Hitler.
The book argues that while Churchill recognized the danger of Nazi Germany, he also saw the Soviet Union as a greater long-term threat.
And that shaped his actions.
Exactly.
Okay, so this brings us to the Allied war aims during World War II, because the book really challenges this idea of a purely just war fought for liberation.
Yeah, it argues that the Allied powers,
Right.
especially Britain and the United States, they had their own geopolitical interests.
Beyond just defeating Nazi Germany.
Right. It highlights the massive destruction inflicted on German cities through strategic bombing campaigns.
Like the firebombing of Dresden.
Yes, a city with little military significance, but immense cultural value.
And the book even mentions this plan, called the Morgenthau Plan, which I'd never even heard of before.
The Morgenthau Plan was a proposal. It was ultimately rejected, but it aimed to deindustrialize Germany after the war.
To turn it into an agrarian society.
Essentially, yeah.
Wow, that's a pretty radical idea.
It was, and the book uses it as an example of the harsh treatment that some Allied leaders envisioned for Germany.
So it wasn't just about preventing future aggression.
The book suggests that it went beyond that there was this desire to punish Germany and to prevent it from ever regaining its status as a major power.
So we're talking about a very different view of World War II.
A much more nuanced view.
One that acknowledges the complexities and
Yeah.
maybe even the morally ambiguous actions of all sides involved.
Exactly.
Okay, so I think we've covered a lot of ground here, and I think it's time to take another break. We'll be back in a moment to wrap up our deep dive into the myth of German villainy.
And we're back for the final part of our deep dive into the myth of German villainy.
This book has really made us rethink some major historical events, especially when it comes to the world wars.
It's definitely challenged some common assumptions.
Before the break, we were discussing the Allied war aims in World War II and how the book kind of pushes back against this simple idea that it was a purely just war fought only for liberation.
It raises some tough questions about the motivations of all sides.
Right. It suggests that maybe things weren't so black and white.
Absolutely. Reducing history to good guys versus bad guys, it can oversimplify things.
It can.
It's important to remember that history is full of nuances,
And that sometimes the lines between good and evil get blurry.
especially during times of war.
So one of the most startling claims in the book is that international Jewry, through its influence in the Soviet Union, the United States, and Britain, played a key role in events leading up to the World Wars, and even benefited from Germany's destruction.
Yeah, that's undoubtedly the book's most controversial argument. It's a perspective that challenges a lot of widely accepted historical interpretations.
And one that some people might find offensive.
Definitely. It's important to note that this is not a universally held view among historians.
Right, it's a perspective that's definitely open to debate.
But regardless of where you stand on that particular issue, I think the book's biggest takeaway is the importance of critical thinking when it comes to history.
That we shouldn't just accept everything we're told.
Exactly. We should always question assumptions, seek out multiple perspectives, and be willing to consider viewpoints that challenge our own beliefs.
Because history is not just about memorizing facts and dates.
It's about understanding the forces that shaped the world we live in
And recognizing that there's always more to the story.
than what we might have been taught.
Well said. This deep dive has definitely given me a lot to think about. It's made me re-examine some of my own assumptions about the world wars and the 20th century.
That's the beauty of history. It's always evolving.
And there's always something new to learn.
So keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep digging deeper.
Until next time, happy diving.
Back for our final part of the dive into the myth of German villainy.
This book has really been quite the journey. I mean, it makes you question so much of what we think we know about the world wars.
You know, it's fascinating how easily we slip into those simple narratives.
Right, like good versus evil, especially when talking about something as horrific as war.
It's understandable, I guess, but like we've been talking about, history is rarely that black and white.
Yeah, we were just discussing the Allied war aims in World War II before the break, and how the book challenges this idea of the Allies fighting a purely just war.
It's not saying that the Nazis weren't a brutal regime, but it's asking us to look deeper, to acknowledge that all sides had their own agendas.
Their own motivations, even
Yeah.
beyond just defeating the enemy.
Right.
And then there's that really controversial claim about international Jewry. The book argues that they actually benefited from Germany's destruction.
That's definitely the most provocative part of the book, and it's one that has sparked a lot of debate.
Yeah, it challenges some commonly held beliefs.
It's important to remember that this is just one perspective, and not all historians agree with it.
So with all this in mind, with all these different perspectives, what do you think is the most important takeaway for our listeners?
I think the biggest lesson is the importance of critical thinking.
To not just accept everything at face value.
Exactly. We should always question assumptions, look for different viewpoints.
Do your own research,
Right, especially when it comes to something as complex as history.
because history isn't static.
It's not just a bunch of facts and dates in a textbook.
It's a living thing, constantly being reinterpreted and debated.
Exactly.
So it's up to each of us to be critical thinkers, to examine the evidence, and to form our own conclusions.
Couldn't agree more.
Well, this deep dive has certainly given me a lot to think about, and I hope it's done the same for our listeners.
It's definitely been a thought-provoking journey.
It has, and it's a reminder that there's always more to learn, always more to uncover. So until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep diving deeper into the mysteries of history.